we are doing anaerobic respiration today, which means respiration in the absence of oxygen. And there's actually more than just this way. And there's also some controversy over when to use this word. But right now in your curriculum, they're referring to anaerobic respiration is basically continuing glycolysis to make ATP. So look at your glycolysis formula right here. Okay, what we focused on so far is that when glucose comes in, what carbon-based molecule comes out? Your pyruvate, okay? And you're able to make how many energies from that? Oh, I moved my thing. Yeah, you're able to make 2 ATP from that. Now, the other thing that is needed to run glycolysis is NAD plus and ADP. And you guys saw that when we did photosynthesis. Okay, it works in a similar way. ATP and NADPH are made in the light reactions, right? And then they go to the Calvin cycle, and once the energy is used, where do they go? Back to the light cycle, right? And it's recycled. So this NAD plus and your ADP, those are your electron carriers, your energy carriers. Okay, they're what accepts the electron. Normally, ADP is pretty easy to find. I'm saying that in quotations because it's very common in the cell. Why? It's like what's left over when the cell uses energy, right? And ATP is the main form of energy that the cell uses. So ADP is readily available in the cell. NADH is not. Okay, in aerobic respiration, when is NADH used? It's an electron carrier, energy carrier. So which part is it used in? The electron transport chain. So it's that same kind of recycling. Glycolysis happens, NADH is made, NADH goes to the electron transport chain, dumps off its electrons, becomes NAD+, goes back to glycolysis. Okay, and I know that was kind of a mouthful, but the way you get NAD+ in aerobic respiration is from the electron transport chain. When NADH donates its electrons to the electron transport chain, NAD+ is left and it goes back to glycolysis. Okay, what happens when you have no oxygen is NADH, this one, NADH builds up in the cell. And if NADH is building up, what are you running out of? You start running out of NAD+. You don't have to circle that, okay? I just did to point it out to you. You run out of NAD+. So the problem that the cell runs into is not running out of glucose, it's not running out of ADP, but the cell will run out of NAD+. There has to be a way to regenerate NAD+. And if there's no electron transport chain, that can't be done. It can't be done when there's no oxygen present because oxygen is required to run the electron transport chain. So when that's not available, a process called fermentation happens that you guys... Okay, so this is glycolysis and fermentation together. Look at this part right here first, from glucose to pyruvate. Okay, that's what you're used to seeing. Glucose comes in, pyruvate comes out, 2 ATP and NADH. Okay, if there's no oxygen available, and this is in a cell that can do alcoholic fermentation, that pyruvate is going to be used to regenerate NAD+. Okay, NADH has received electrons from glucose, right? So was it reduced or oxidized? It was reduced, right? Because it accepted electrons from glucose. But now I need to get rid of that electron and I need to get rid of that hydrogen, so it needs to be oxidized. Okay, pyruvate is going to accept the electrons from NADH. Pyruvate is what we're going to use to regenerate NAD+. So just follow your diagram. It receives the electrons and it produces what? Ethanol and CO2. Okay, so pyruvate was reduced to form ethanol and CO2. And the whole reason that the cell did that is because there was no oxygen available. Now the cell has NAD+. You see where it says replenishment? Okay, now the cell has NAD+, and it can continue making ATP. So the whole purpose of fermentation is just to make what? You're not making ATP with fermentation, you're making what? NAD+, so that you can keep the cycle running. Okay, small organisms can do this mostly because it only gives you how many ATP? It only gives you 2 because it's just the ATP from glycolysis. So organisms that can do this are yeast and bacteria, but animals, okay, we can do one type of fermentation in our muscle cells to give us a little bit of energy. So this fermentation, okay, in small organisms, this can be used, glycolysis plus fermentation, can be used to keep the organism alive. It can be used as a primary source of respiration. But for animals, for larger organisms, it's just supplemental. It's not enough energy to keep a large organism alive. It's supplemental for certain types of cells. Why would your muscles be the cells able to do this? They do the most work, right? They do the most work. So when you're, for example, lifting weights is considered an anaerobic activity. Whenever you put a lot of strain on your muscles and you have to have a large input of energy, those cells will do aerobic respiration plus anaerobic. The anaerobic is supplemental. So anaerobic respiration is 2 parts. Anaerobic exercises, like I said, are like lifting weights. They're not things like that. Like cardio is not anaerobic. It can be if you do it for long enough. But anaerobic exercise is just exercise that, like I said, like lifting weights that puts a lot of strain on your muscles that requires them to input additional energy. Where you use a lot of oxygen. And like I said, that eventually can become anaerobic, especially like if you're running a long distance. Okay, but we got to keep moving. So aerobic means with energy, or not with energy, just kidding, with oxygen. And then anaerobic means without. But I'm going to write it up here because there's something I want to put in that box. And I'm sorry that this printed so dark. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Respiration, there's this big misconception that fermentation is respiration. That's not true. Respiration is glycolysis plus fermentation because you can't make ATP with fermentation. The only thing you can do with fermentation is regenerate your NAD+. So anaerobic respiration is glycolysis plus fermentation. But we're going to kind of put those 2 formulas together to compare them to aerobic respiration right now. So we're going to write our equation for aerobic respiration again, but instead of writing left to right, we're going to write up to down so that we can make some comparisons. You are going to compare like in rows when we're finished, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So what we're going to start with up here is oxygen, because that's what aerobic respiration has that anaerobic does not. I've been writing the chemical formulas all day, but I think I want to use the words. Okay, so let's write oxygen. Okay, and then leave yourself, I'm intentionally leaving a little extra space. Okay, so oxygen goes in, and what's the energy source for respiration? It's glucose. That's the energy that's made, but it's glucose that goes in. But cells can use more than just glucose. Like you guys don't just eat pure sugar all day, right? Like you eat other carbs. So we're going to write sugars here because tomorrow you're actually going to test which sugar works best. Okay, you're actually going to test which sugar works best tomorrow. So oxygen plus sugars, okay, makes what? What gas is released? CO2, the carbon dioxide. Okay, and then because I'm using oxygen, what else is produced? Water. Okay, and then what I'm missing is the purpose of respiration. I didn't quite leave myself enough room, but we'll be okay. Which is what? How much ATP? 36 ATP. And so again, this is the form of respiration that large organisms require because our energy needs are great. Oxygen is required for large multicellular organisms. Okay, so that's respiration. So now what we're going to do is kind of write a simplified formula of what each anaerobic respiration is, starting with alcoholic. Okay, so what I want you to do, I want you to leave this space up here blank, because this is actually where we're going to take some notes on what we need to know about alcoholic fermentation. So we're going to start right here. What is the energy source for anaerobic respiration? Still what? Still glucose, still sugars, because they're both starting with glycolysis. Aerobic and anaerobic both break down sugar. So this is still, I changed colors on accident, but that's okay. Okay, yes, that's what I just said. You still start with sugars. Okay, you can flip over to your back page if you need to. With alcoholic fermentation, do you still make carbon dioxide? Look at your picture. Yes, you make ethanol and carbon dioxide. So I'm trying to line up things that are the same. You guys see that? To make it easier to look at later. So I still make carbon dioxide. Okay, do I make water? No, because what do you need? What do you need to make water? You've got to have oxygen to make water, and I don't have oxygen. So no type of anaerobic respiration produces water because you need oxygen to make water. So what's produced instead is ethanol, or sometimes you'll see it ethyl alcohol. Okay, this is called alcoholic fermentation. It produces alcohol. How many ATP are made? Just 2. Okay, and again, I'm writing like this so that I can compare. All right, so as humans, I did it again. We've really taken advantage of this fermentation process in order to make what? Alcohol. Alcoholic beverages are made through alcoholic fermentation. Okay, you use yeast, or in some cases bacteria, to make alcoholic beverages like wine and beer. The energy source that you give them determines what type of beverage will be made. So you need to know what organisms can do alcoholic fermentation. Okay, and that's going to be yeast. And they are what we call facultative anaerobes. Okay, an anaerobe is a microorganism that can make energy without oxygen. If it's facultative, that means it just does it when it has to. So if they have oxygen available, they'll just do respiration. Why? What makes more energy, aerobic respiration or anaerobic? Aerobic. So if oxygen's available, they'll always do aerobic respiration. But if there is no oxygen available, this is an advantage because they're able to stay alive in an environment where there's no oxygen. They can't do it forever, though, because they end up dying in their own ethanol, which is really wild to think about. But they can only do anaerobic respiration for a limited amount of time in a closed space because eventually the alcohol level becomes so high that it kills the yeast. And okay, but that's one use is alcoholic beverages. And real quick, I want to get our second use in before we leave today. We've got a little more time. We also use this to make yeast bread. Most of the things that we bake with, like if you guys are baking at home, to make it rise, like if you're making a cake, you probably use a chemical leavener like baking soda, baking powder, or salt. A chemical reaction causes your cake or bread to rise. But yeast bread and yeast rolls are made with yeast. They do alcoholic fermentation and release what? Which one do you think makes the bread rise? Carbon dioxide or ethanol? It's the carbon dioxide. Like when you tear open a yeast roll, you know how like fluffy, not, I don't know if fluffy is the right word, but holy on the inside, those are holes from where the CO2 is. So the carbon dioxide, you need to know it makes bread rise. Now, when you actually eat the yeast roll, there is no alcohol in it. Can you think of why? Yeah, it evaporates. Alcohol evaporates at a very low temperature anyways, but when you're baking at like 350, that's definitely high enough to evaporate any of the alcohol. Now, so that is alcoholic fermentation. Okay, if you want to make a note, what I did in the other classes too, we don't have a lot of room here, but I wrote beer and wine. That's a commercial use. And then also it makes bread rise. Okay, and the primary sugar that's used with alcoholic fermentation is things like sucrose, fructose. Organisms that use more lactose to make their anaerobic energy do lactic acid fermentation. So you still have sugars. Okay, you do not release any carbon dioxide. So you can just, if you want to put a cross right there, you can, because there's no gas released. And then instead of ethanol, if alcoholic fermentation makes alcohol, what does lactic acid fermentation make?
Alcohol.
Lactic acid. Okay, but because I'm relying on glycolysis for ATP, how many ATP am I still making? Just 2. Let me push this up a little bit for you guys. Now, again, our muscle cells can do this. When your muscles burn after a workout, it's from one of the things it's from is from lactic acid buildup. Okay, so lactic acid buildup is what makes our muscles burn. We can't live off lactic acid fermentation, but it can give our muscles the additional energy they need. And the other, like lactose, like dairy, your fermented dairy products are made in this way. So yogurt, you know how yogurt's kind of tangy? It's because it's got bacteria in it that we're doing lactic acid fermentation. So this is what makes dairy, and it's what your muscle cells are able to do. Tomorrow, because sometimes the bell rings early, but this is what's in our muscles, and this is what's in fermented dairy. You can look on your yogurt. Most yogurt will say lactobacillus on it. Lactobacillus is the bacteria that can break down yogurt, and it's also a bacteria that you need in your gut to help you digest lactose. That concludes our photosynthesis and respiration notes. If you will check out the Kahoot code that is on your study list, there are some good sample questions for fermentation on there. Please let me know if you have any questions.